By August 1521, one of the greatest cities on earth had been reduced to rubble and ash, its people starving, its streets flooded with sewage, its emperor a prisoner on a Spanish ship. The empire that built it had ruled more than 5 million people. The man who destroyed it arrived with 600 soldiers and 16 horses, which means this was never a conquest, it was an uprising. Before a single Spanish cannon was aimed at Tenochtitlan's walls, more than 100,000 indigenous warriors had already crossed to Cortés's side, not because he forced them, but because the Aztec Empire had spent a century giving them reasons to. Every tribute demanded, every prisoner dragged to the sacrificial stone, every nation humiliated into submission. For a century, the empire had been building enemies faster than it could control them, and by 1521, that debt came due. The question historians keep asking is how 600 men defeated an empire of millions. That's the wrong question. The right one is, why so many people? People the Aztec had conquered, taxed, bled, and broken. Looked at a foreign invader and decided he was the better option. To find that answer, we have to go 150 miles east of Tenochtitlan to a city called Tlaxcala, where the fate of the Aztec Empire may have been decided before the Spanish ever saw its capital. Tlaxcala was everything the Aztec Empire wanted and could never have. Surrounded on all sides by Aztec territory, it had never been conquered, not for lack of trying. The Aztec had fought the Tlaxcala for decades in what were called the Flower Wars, ritual conflicts designed less to kill than to capture, because the Aztec needed a steady supply of prisoners for sacrifice. The Tlaxcala had been chosen deliberately as a permanent enemy, close enough to raid, strong enough to keep fighting, never allowed to integrate into the empire's tribute system. They were kept alive to be hunted. When Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, the Tlaxcala did not welcome him. They fought him hard. 3 battles in under a month, thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors against a few hundred exhausted Spaniards. Cortés nearly lost everything in those engagements. What saved him was a simple calculation the Tlaxcalan leadership made after those battles. The Spanish could be beaten, but the cost of beating them was enormous, and the Aztec was still out there, waiting. An alliance with these strange foreigners offered something a century of warfare never had, a chance to end it. The Tlaxcalan Council voted. They chose Cortés, and with that decision, the Aztec Empire's clock started running. What followed was not an immediate march on Tenochtitlan. Cortés spent months consolidating, adding allied cities as he moved west, testing Spanish steel and horses against city after city that had spent years under Aztec domination. By the time he reached the shores of Lake Texcoco and looked out at Tenochtitlan, the great island city, larger than any in Spain, its towers rising from the water, its causeways stretching to the mainland, he was leading something that no longer looked like a Spanish expedition. It looked like a coalition of everyone the Aztec Empire had ever wronged. Tenochtitlan received him with calculated hospitality. Emperor Moctezuma II came out personally to greet Cortés at the city gates, a decision that has puzzled historians ever since. Whether he believed Cortés was a god, a threat to be neutralized through diplomacy, or simply a man he intended to study before destroying, no one fully knows. What happened next removed any ambiguity. Within days, Cortés had taken Moctezuma hostage inside his own palace. The city did not immediately revolt, but it simmered. While Cortés left to deal with a rival Spanish expedition on the coast, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado, nervous and trigger-happy, ordered a massacre of Aztec nobles gathered for a religious festival in the city's main temple. Hundreds were killed. The city erupted. By the time Cortés returned, Tenochtitlan was no longer a place that could be controlled. It was a trap. On the night of June 30th, 1520, a rainy, dark night chosen specifically for cover, Cortés made the decision to abandon the city. He ordered his men to move silently across the causeways before dawn, carrying with them whatever gold they could drag. A woman spotted them. She screamed. The drums on top of the Great Pyramid began to sound, and within minutes the causeways were swarming with Aztec warriors, attacking from land and from canoes on both sides. The portable bridge the Spanish had built for crossing the gaps in the causeway jammed and couldn't be moved. Men at the back of the column were trapped. Those who tried to swim drowned under the weight of their armor and stolen gold. Cortés lost hundreds of Spanish soldiers that night and thousands of Tlaxcalan allies, along with most of his artillery and nearly all the treasure. He made it to the mainland and, according to the accounts of his own soldiers, sat beneath a great tree and wept. The Aztecs had driven out the invaders. The city was free. The empire, it seemed, had survived. What arrived next, the Aztec had no word for. Among the soldiers in Narvaez's rival expedition, the men who had come to arrest Cortés and been absorbed into his force instead, one man carried something invisible. An African slave named Francisco de Eguía had smallpox. He died among the Totonac people near Veracruz. His caretakers caught it. Smallpox spreads through the air, through touch, through breath, and it raced across a continent that had never encountered it. By September 1520, it had reached Tenochtitlan. The epidemic lasted 70 days inside the city. It killed nearly 40% of the population. Among the dead was Emperor Cuauhtémoc, the man who had led the uprising that drove Cortés out, who had ruled for exactly 80 days before the disease took him. His military commanders died with him. The Aztec chain of command, already fractured by Moctezuma's captivity and death, collapsed entirely. A city that had watched Cortés weeping under a tree in June was, by November, burying its dead in collapsed houses because there was no one left to dig the graves properly. The new emperor was a young man named Cuauhtémoc. He inherited a city already broken, its leadership dead, its warriors depleted, its food supplies disrupted by the chaos of the epidemic. What he understood, clearly and without illusion, was that Cortés would come back. The only question was whether Tenochtitlan could be made to hold. It could not. But Cuauhtémoc tried anyway. Cortés spent the months after La Noche Triste doing something no one in the region had ever attempted. He had brigantines, flat-bottomed warships, built in pieces in Tlaxcala, carried over the mountains in sections and assembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco. 13 ships, each armed with a cannon. When they launched in April 1521, they gave him control of the lake itself, cutting off Tenochtitlan's supply lines and encircling the island completely. The siege began in earnest on May 26, 1521. 3 land columns, each led by one of Cortés's captains, each backed by tens of thousands of allied warriors, attacked the 3 great causeways simultaneously while the brigantines sealed off the water. Cortés's strategy was simple and brutal. No food enters the city, no one leaves, and every building taken is burned, so the Aztec cannot use it for cover. The Aztec defended with everything they had. Warriors planted sharpened stakes in the lake bottom to impale the brigantines. They dug gaps in the causeways every night, so the Spanish had to refill them every morning. They learned to target the ship's vulnerable sides with war canoes. At one point, in a desperate surge through an inadequately filled canal crossing, Cortés himself was seized by Aztec warriors and dragged off his horse, saved only when a Tlaxcalan soldier threw himself between the conquistador and the men pulling him away. Several Spaniards were captured that day. The defenders dragged them to the top of the Great Pyramid and sacrificed them in full view of the Spanish lines, to the sound of the war drums. The Spanish watched their comrades die and couldn't do anything about it. But starvation is patient, and Tenochtitlan was an island. By July, the city had no food left. The people were drinking salt water from the lake. They ate insects, mud, tree bark. Women and children filled gaps in the warrior ranks. The Aztec never stopped fighting, but each night they had less to fight with, and each morning there were fewer of them. The last formal resistance collapsed when Alvarado's forces broke through to the Tlatelolco marketplace on July 27th and killed those still holding it. Cuauhtémoc made one last decision. On August 13th, 1521, he boarded a canoe and tried to cross the lake. Whether to escape or to regroup elsewhere and continue fighting, his intentions remain unclear. A Spanish brigantine intercepted him on the water. He was brought before Cortés in chains and, by the Spanish accounts, placed his hand on the conquistador's dagger and asked to be killed. Cortés refused. That refusal was not mercy, it was calculation. The gold was missing, the enormous treasure that was supposed to have been in the city, and Cortés needed to know where it was. What came next is the part most documentaries skip. Cuauhtémoc was tortured. His feet were bathed in oil and held over open coals, along with the Tlatoani of a neighboring city. The interrogators wanted the gold. During the torture, the other man broke, or came close to it, and turned to Cuauhtémoc, begging silently with his eyes for permission to speak. Cuauhtémoc looked at him and said, "Do you think I am in a bed of roses?" Cuauhtémoc's feet on the coals, the city already gone. Drop in the comments. Do you think he told them anything, or was the silence the only thing left he could win? He told them nothing. The torture produced no gold because most of it had already been thrown into the lake during the chaos of the siege. The treasure Cortés had spent 2 years pursuing, that thousands of men had died for, was sitting at the bottom of Lake Texcoco. Cuauhtémoc survived his torture and remained a prisoner for 4 more years. In 1525, Cortés took him on an expedition to Honduras, afraid to leave him behind in case he organized a rebellion in the absence. Somewhere along that march, Cortés received word, or claimed to, of a plot against him. He ordered Cuauhtémoc hanged. The last emperor of the Aztec Empire died on a trail in the jungle, far from the city he had tried to defend, executed by the man who had burned it. Tenochtitlan itself was dismantled, stone by stone. The temples were torn down, the canals were filled, the great market was cleared. On its ruins, the Spanish built their capital, Mexico City, laying colonial foundations directly over the Aztec ones, sometimes using the same stones. The city that could not be conquered became the ground beneath the city that replaced it. What the Spanish conquest demonstrated, not just in Mexico, but wherever European expansion went, was that an empire's greatest vulnerability is never its walls or its weapons. It's the count of the people outside those walls who want them to fall. The Aztec didn't lose to Spain, they lost to the 100 years of enemies they'd made building the empire in the first place. Cortés understood that. He didn't conquer Tenochtitlan, he handed its enemies a battering ram. The deeper we dig into the past, the more we understand the present. I'm Zombo, and there's always more to discover.